The Fort Smith sun, a hazy orange orb sinking towards the horizon, cast long shadows across the near-empty parking lot of Whitmore's Chop House. Dust motes danced in the anemic light filtering through the grimy windows. Inside, the air hung heavy, stagnant, not with the rich aroma of sizzling steaks and caramelized onions that had once been the hallmark of the Whitmore brand, but with a faint, greasy smell and the lingering scent of stale beer. Daniel Whitmore, disguised in a worn denim jacket and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes, pushed open the heavy wooden door, a familiar chime announcing his arrival. The sound, once a source of pride, now echoed with the hollow ring of failure. A young man, the host, barely glanced up from his phone. "Table for one," he mumbled, his voice flat, devoid of any welcoming warmth. Daniel nodded, his gaze sweeping over the sparsely populated dining room. Booths sat empty, their red leather cracked and faded. The once gleaming mahogany bar was dull and sticky. This Fort Smith branch, once a shining jewel in the Whitmore crown, had clearly lost its luster. He was led to a booth near the back, the silence punctuated only by the low hum of the air conditioning and the clatter of dishes from the kitchen. He picked up a menu, the familiar script logo now slightly blurred, the corners dog-eared. Ribeye. It had always been his favorite. He'd built an empire on the perfect ribeye, aged and seasoned with a secret blend of spices passed down through generations. Now, sitting here under an assumed name, he wondered if even that legacy could survive the rot that seemed to have infested this place. The financial reports had been bleak, a steady decline in revenue for the past 2 years. He'd initially attributed it to the changing economic landscape, the rise of fast casual chains, but something about the numbers hadn't sat right. A gnawing suspicion, a sixth sense honed over decades in the restaurant business, had brought him here, incognito, to see for himself. A shadow fell across the table. "Afternoon, sir. My name's Jenna. I'll be taking care of you today." Her voice was low, almost a murmur, tinged with an exhaustion that went deeper than the end of a long shift. Daniel looked up, meeting her gaze. Her eyes, a startling shade of green against her pale skin, held a flicker of something he couldn't quite decipher: fear, resignation, or perhaps a sliver of defiance. "What do folks usually order here?" he asked, his voice roughened to match his assumed persona. He watched her closely, noting the slight hesitation, the almost imperceptible tightening of her lips. Her hand trembled slightly as she placed a glass of water on the table, the ice clinking against the glass, a brittle sound in the quiet restaurant. Jenna's mind raced. This man, with his weathered face and calloused hands, didn't seem like the usual Fort Smith clientele. There was a sharpness in his eyes, an intensity that made her uneasy. Bryce, the manager, would be furious if she steered a customer wrong. But something about this man he felt different. "The ribeye," she finally answered, her voice barely above a whisper. It's what Whitmore's is known for." The lie felt heavy on her tongue. The ribeyes here were often tough, overcooked, a pale imitation of the legendary steaks the chain had built its reputation on. He saw the flicker of something in her eyes, a fleeting emotion he couldn't quite place. Dishonesty? Or something else entirely? "All right, then," he said, his gaze holding hers for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. "Ribeye it is." He leaned back against the worn leather, his mind already working, piecing together the fragments of information he'd gleaned so far. The empty tables, the apathetic staff, the subtle tremor in the waitress's hand. It was more than just mismanagement. It felt like something darker, something deliberately orchestrated. He watched as Jenna retreated towards the kitchen, her shoulders slumped, her gait heavy. She disappeared through the swinging doors, and for a moment, the silence returned, heavy and oppressive. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, the faint scent of disinfectant doing little to mask the underlying staleness. He thought of his grandfather, a butcher by trade, who had instilled in him a deep respect for the art of preparing meat, for the connection between food and community. This restaurant, this entire chain, was more than just a business. It was a legacy, and he wouldn't let it be tarnished by greed and corruption. He opened his eyes, his gaze settling on the bar where Glenn Tate, the regional manager, sat nursing a drink. Glenn's expensive suit and slicked-back hair seemed out of place in the dilapidated restaurant. He was here on a surprise visit, supposedly to offer support to the struggling branch. But Daniel had a different theory. He'd seen the subtle glances between Glenn and Bryce, the hushed conversations in the back office. He suspected they were in cahoots, skimming profits, lining their own pockets while the restaurant withered and died. He felt a surge of anger, a cold, hard knot in his stomach. He'd worked tirelessly to build this empire, brick by brick, steak by steak. And he wouldn't let these vultures tear it down. He reached for his phone, his fingers hovering over the contact for Alicia Knox, his associate, his legal counsel, his fixer. It was time to bring in the cavalry. He needed evidence, hard proof, and he had a feeling Jenna, the weary waitress with the haunted eyes, might just be the key. The chipped ceramic mug warmed Daniel's hand, the lukewarm coffee doing little to dispel the lingering chill of the February air. He took a slow sip, the bitter taste mirroring the unsettling quiet of the restaurant. Whitmore's Chop House, Fort Smith branch. His chop house. The name, once a source of pride, now felt heavy, tainted by the pervasive air of neglect. He watched as a young couple entered, their initial enthusiasm quickly fading as they took in the worn booths, the flickering fluorescent lights, and the general air of disinterest emanating from the lone host. The host, a skinny kid with acne and a name tag that read Kevin, mumbled a greeting, leading them to a table near the back. No smile, no genuine welcome, just a perfunctory performance. Daniel's stomach tightened. This wasn't the Whitmores he'd built. More coffee, sir? The voice, soft yet firm, startled him. He looked up to see a waitress, her name tag identifying her as Jenna, standing beside him. Her eyes, a striking shade of hazel, held a flicker of something he couldn't quite decipher. Apprehension? Perhaps a hint of defiance? Yes, please, he replied, his own voice deliberately neutral. He observed her as she refilled his mug, her movements precise and efficient, a stark contrast to the lethargy he'd witnessed in the other staff. There was a weariness about her, a tightness around her mouth that spoke of burdens carried too long. He wondered what story she held, what secrets lay beneath the professional facade. He picked up the menu again, pretending to study it, while his gaze continued to sweep the room. Bryce, the manager, was leaning against the bar, talking on his phone. His laughter, loud and boisterous, grated on Daniel's nerves. It felt forced, performative, designed to project an image of easy confidence. Daniel had learned over the years that the loudest voices often masked the deepest insecurities. He watched as Bryce winked at a young waitress, his hand lingering a moment too long on her shoulder. Disgust coiled in Daniel's gut. This wasn't just mismanagement. It was something far more insidious. His order arrived, the signature Whitmore's ribeye. The aroma, usually a source of comfort and pride, felt strangely flat. The meat, though cooked to the requested medium rare, lacked the characteristic sear, the vibrant juices that were the hallmark of his carefully crafted recipe. He cut a piece, chewing slowly, his mind racing. The decline in quality wasn't just due to poor management. It felt deliberate, almost malicious, as if someone was actively sabotaging the very essence of his legacy. He ate in silence, his thoughts a turbulent mix of anger and frustration. He'd poured his heart and soul into building this business, sacrificing everything to create something he believed in. To see it crumbling like this, to witness the blatant disregard for his vision, felt like a personal betrayal. Jenna returned to clear his plate. "Everything all right, sir?" she asked, her voice low, almost a murmur. "Fine," he replied, forcing a smile. He knew he couldn't reveal his true identity yet. He needed to gather more information, to understand the full extent of the rot that had infested his restaurant. She placed the check on the table, her hand brushing against his for a fleeting second. He felt a small, folded piece of paper pressed discreetly into his palm. His heart quickened. He waited until she'd moved away before unfolding the note. The words, scrawled in hurried handwriting, sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. "If you're really who I think you are, please don't leave without talking to me." He reread the note, his mind racing. Jenna. She knew. But how? And why was she taking such a risk? He glanced over at her, her back turned as she busied herself with another table. He could feel the weight of her gaze, the silent plea in her hazel eyes. He had to tread carefully. This could be a trap, a setup. But something in her demeanor, the quiet desperation he'd sensed in her earlier, told him otherwise. He took a deep breath, his resolve hardening. He wouldn't leave. He would stay and uncover the truth, no matter the cost. He owed it to himself, to his legacy, and to Jenna, the brave waitress who had risked everything to reach out to him in the shadows of his failing empire. His hand tightened around the note, the small piece of paper a beacon of hope in the gathering darkness. He signaled for the check, his mind already strategizing his next move. The game was on. The faint scent of frying onions, a constant companion in the Whitmore's Chop House universe, hung heavy in the air, tinged with the acrid undertone of something burning. Daniel Whitmore, disguised in a nondescript polo shirt and jeans, sat at his table, the untouched steak growing cold on his plate. He unfolded the napkin again, smoothing out the creases, his thumb tracing the barely legible message scrawled in hurried ink. Bryce stealing. Employees scared. Talk to Jenna. He lifted his gaze, his eyes scanning the bustling yet strangely subdued dining area. He located Jenna, a slender figure in the standard Whitmore's uniform, her movements economical, her face carefully neutral as she cleared a nearby table. Their eyes met for a fleeting instant, a silent acknowledgement passing between them, before she quickly averted her gaze, a nervous twitch in her jaw the only betrayal of her inner turmoil. Jenna, he thought, the name a fragile anchor in the sea of his mounting suspicion. She's taking a big risk. He could feel a slow burn of anger kindling in his chest, a cold, calculating anger that was far more dangerous than a sudden outburst. This wasn't just incompetence. It was a calculated betrayal. The air in the restaurant suddenly felt thick, suffocating, the cheery decor a mocking facade. He thought of his father, the original Whitmore, his gruff voice echoing in Daniel's memory. Integrity. Daniel, that's all we've got. Don't ever let go of that. His father's words, once a comforting mantra, now felt like a heavy weight in his gut. He pushed the plate away, the greasy sheen of the untouched steak now repulsive. He needed to act, to dissect this festering wound and cauterize it before it spread. He took a slow sip of his iced tea, the gesture a conscious attempt to project calm, while his mind raced, assembling the pieces. The almost deserted dining room on a Friday night. The listless, almost robotic movements of the staff. The unsettling stillness in the air, punctuated only by the clatter of dishes and the muted murmurs of a few scattered diners. It all pointed to a deeper malaise, a systemic rot that had taken root and spread through this once thriving branch. And Bryce, the manager, the man who had greeted him with such an oily, overpracticed smile, was clearly at the center of it. He watched Jenna again, now refilling water glasses at a table near the back. She avoided his gaze, but he could sense her awareness of him, a taut energy radiating from her. She's terrified, he realized, a pang of guilt hitting him. He had walked into this place, an outsider, stirring up a hornet's nest, and this young woman had been brave enough to hand him a match. He rose from his table, the chair scraping against the tiled floor, the sound amplified in the unervingly quiet room. The host, a young man with vacant eyes and a perpetually slack jaw, barely registered his movement. Daniel headed towards the back, his steps measured, his mind already formulating his next move. He needed to get Jenna alone, to hear her story, to understand the full extent of Bryce's operation. He reached the swinging doors that marked the entrance to the employee-only hallway, the greasy smell of the kitchen momentarily overwhelming the cloying sweetness of the dining area. He paused for a moment, taking a deep breath, steeling himself for the confrontation he knew was coming. As he pushed open the door, a figure materialized before him, blocking his path. "Bryce!" His smile, still plastered on his face, had lost its earlier warmth, replaced by something cold and brittle. "Sir," he said, his voice smooth, but with an underlying edge, "restrooms are on the other side." Daniel met his gaze, a flicker of something unreadable in his own eyes. "You free to talk?" he asked, his voice low and even. Bryce's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a tiny crack in his carefully constructed facade. He hesitated, his eyes darting towards the dining room, then back to Daniel. "He's assessing me," Daniel thought, weighing his options. A bead of sweat trickled down Bryce's temple, a tiny betrayal of the tension coiling beneath his surface. He glanced again at the dining room, as if searching for an escape route, but the sparse crowd offered no cover. He was trapped, and he knew it. The scent of burnt onions intensified, a subtle, acrid reminder of the decay beneath the veneer of normalcy. "Of course, sir," Bryce finally said, his voice regaining its smooth veneer, though a tremor of unease remained. "What can I do for you?" His eyes, though, told a different story. They were wary, calculating, the eyes of a cornered animal. The hallway behind him was dimly lit, the sounds of the kitchen muffled, creating an unsettling sense of isolation. Daniel knew he had him where he wanted him. The first move had been made, the game had begun, and the stakes were higher than either of them could have imagined. The air in the storage closet hung thick and heavy, a blend of dust, mildew, and the faint, metallic tang of cleaning supplies. Jenna pulled the door closed behind them, the click echoing in the confined space. The sudden shift from the bustling, albeit strained, atmosphere of the dining area to this suffocating quiet amplified the tremor in her hands. "He actually followed me." The thought, half disbelief, half desperate hope, pulsed in her chest. She'd gambled everything on a hunch, on the flicker of something in Daniel Whitmore's eyes, a quiet intensity that didn't match the amiable smile he'd worn for the staff. Daniel studied her face, the shadows obscuring the details, but not the fear that clung to her like the dampness in the air. He'd seen that same fear in the eyes of other employees, a veiled, almost instinctive flinch when Bryce's shadow fell across the room. "It's all right," he said, his voice low and calm, a deliberate counterpoint to the chaotic rhythm of his own thoughts. "She knows something, more than she let on in the dining room." Jenna swallowed, the dryness in her throat making it a struggle. She'd rehearsed this moment 100 times, the words forming and dissolving in her mind like smoke. But now, facing the man whose legacy was being tarnished under his own roof, the carefully constructed sentences crumbled. "Bryce," she began, then stopped, her voice barely above a whisper. The name itself seemed to constrict the air around them, making it harder to breathe. "Bryce isn't just rude. He's dangerous." Daniel leaned against a stack of unused tablecloths, his posture relaxed, but his gaze sharp and unwavering. "Dangerous?" The word resonated, aligning with the unease that had prickled at him since he'd arrived. The discrepancies in the inventory, the strained smiles of the staff, the almost palpable tension humming beneath the surface of forced normalcy. It was a pattern he'd seen before, a subtle decay that could rot a business from the inside out. "What do you mean, dangerous?" he asked, each word carefully measured. Jenna's gaze darted to the closed door, as if expecting Bryce to materialize through the thin wood. "He takes a cut of our tips. Every night." She wrung her hands, the chapped skin rough against itself. "Will he believe me? Will he even care?" Doubt gnawed at her resolve. "And not just a little. Sometimes half, sometimes more. If we complain," she trailed off, the unspoken threat hanging heavy in the air. The pieces clicked into place in Daniel's mind. The unusually low reported tips, the staff's reluctance to meet his eye. It was a simple scheme, but effective, preying on the vulnerability of those least able to fight back. "And Glenn?" he asked, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. Glenn Tate, the regional manager, a man he'd trusted, a man he'd mentored. Jenna's eyes widened, a flicker of surprise crossing her face. "He knows about Glenn? How?" "He get to share," she admitted, the words barely audible. "Bryce says it's to keep him quiet." to make sure things run smoothly. A cold knot tightened in Daniel's stomach. Betrayal had a particular sting, especially when it came from someone you'd once considered an ally. "They're scared," Jenna continued, her voice gaining a fragile strength. "We all are. He can be violent. He's hinted implied things." She looked away, unable to articulate the full extent of Bryce's intimidation tactics. The implied threats, the casual displays of aggression, the constant pressure to comply or face the consequences. "Why tell me?" Daniel asked, his voice soft, but the question hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken implications. He knew the risks she was taking, the potential repercussions of speaking out. Jenna met his gaze, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and weary determination. "I saw your face today, when you were talking to the staff, when you looked at the books. I didn't think you'd come back. Not like this. Not undercover." A flicker of hope ignited in the depths of her exhaustion. Maybe, just maybe, he can fix this. Daniel felt a surge of something akin to shame. He'd built his business on a foundation of honesty and integrity, and yet, under his very nose, this rot had taken hold. He'd been so focused on expansion, on the bigger picture, that he'd failed to see the cracks forming in the foundation. "I wouldn't have seen it if you hadn't said something," he admitted, a quiet acknowledgement of her courage. Jenna reached into her pocket, her hand trembling slightly, and pulled out a small, tarnished key. She placed it in Daniel's palm, the metal cold against his skin. "Bryce's locker," she whispered. "In the back office. He keeps records. Proof." The weight of the key felt disproportionately heavy. It was a small, unassuming object, yet it held the potential to unlock the truth, to expose the corruption that had festered within his restaurant. He closed his hand around it, the metal biting into his palm, a physical reminder of the responsibility he now carried. "This changes everything." The quiet intensity in his eyes hardened into resolve. He looked at Jenna, a genuine, heartfelt gratitude replacing the carefully composed mask he'd worn earlier. "Thank you," he said, the words inadequate, yet carrying the full weight of his sincerity. He would not let her courage be in vain. He would fix this. He would restore the integrity of his name, and he would make sure that those responsible for this corruption faced the consequences. The fight had begun. The flickering neon sign of the Budget Inn cast a lurid glow across the chipped Formica tabletop in Daniel's room. He sat, the lukewarm remains of takeout barbecue congealing on the plastic plate beside him, staring at the wall. The muted drone of the highway traffic seeped through the thin walls, a constant, low hum that mirrored the unease in his gut. He'd known, deep down, that the Fort Smith branch wasn't simply failing. There was a rot there, a malignancy that ran deeper than poor management. He picked up his phone, the screen reflecting the weariness in his eyes. A new message. No caller ID. Just a location. A back alley, 2 blocks down, behind a laundromat. His pulse quickened. This had to be her. Jenna, the waitress. The fear in her eyes had been so palpable, so raw, that it cut through the carefully constructed facade of normalcy in that dying restaurant. He hesitated for only a moment. He'd spent his life building Whitmore's, brick by brick, steak by steak. He wouldn't let some 2-bit grifter dismantle it. He tucked the phone into his pocket and headed out, the humid night air thick and heavy like a shroud. The alley was a narrow chasm of shadows, the stench of overflowing dumpsters mingling with the sickly sweet scent of spilled soda. A single, bare bulb flickered above a fire escape, casting the brick walls in a stark, alternating pattern of light and dark. He saw her almost immediately, huddled in the deeper shadows near the back. Jenna. She wore a dark hoodie pulled low over her face, the fabric clinging to her in the dampness. He approached slowly, cautious but determined. "Jenna?" he asked, his voice a low murmur. She flinched, her head snapping up. Relief washed over her face when she recognized him, quickly replaced by a lingering anxiety. He saw the tremors in her hands as she pushed back the hood. "Mr. Whitmore," she breathed, her voice tight with tension. He could see the fatigue etched into the lines around her eyes, the exhaustion that came not just from long shifts, but from carrying a heavy burden of fear and secrecy. He nodded, his gaze searching hers. "You said you had something to tell me." Her eyes flickered nervously towards the alley entrance, a quick, darting movement that spoke volumes about her unease. "Inside," she whispered, gesturing towards the back door of the laundromat. "It's closed, but I have a key." He followed her, his mind racing. What could be so sensitive that she couldn't even speak about it in a deserted alley? The laundromat was a cavernous space, rows of silent machines shrouded in the dim light filtering through the grimy windows. The air hung heavy with the scent of detergent and stale water. She led him to a small, cluttered office in the back, the door secured by a flimsy lock that yielded easily to her key. Inside, a single desk lamp illuminated piles of crumpled receipts and dusty ledgers. Jenna closed the door behind them, the click echoing in the stillness. She turned to him, her expression a mix of fear and determination. He saw the internal battle raging within her, the struggle between her fear of Bryce and her desperate need to expose him. He watched her, his own thoughts a swirling vortex of suspicion and anticipation. He had seen enough in his lifetime to recognize the signs of genuine fear, and he knew, with an unshakable certainty, that this young woman was risking everything. He could almost taste the metallic tang of fear in the air. "What is it, Jenna?" he asked, his voice soft, encouraging. She took a deep breath, as if steeling herself for a blow. "Bryce," she started, her voice barely a whisper. "He's stealing from you, Mr. Whitmore. A lot." He wasn't surprised. The numbers had hinted at it, the discrepancies too blatant to be mere incompetence. But hearing it confirmed, seeing the raw fear in her eyes, solidified the cold knot of anger forming in his stomach. "Ow," he asked, his voice deceptively calm. He needed details, hard evidence. He needed to dismantle Bryce's operation and ensure it couldn't be replicated elsewhere. Jenna hesitated, wringing her hands. "He schemes the cash," she explained, her voice gaining a little strength. "Every night, he takes a cut from the register. He forces us to underreport tips, threatens us if we don't comply." Her words confirmed his suspicions, but there was something more, something unspoken that hung in the air between them. He could sense it. "And," he prompted, his gaze steady. She flinched. "And that he's got Glenn in on it. Glenn Tate, the regional manager, his trusted lieutenant." A wave of nausea washed over Daniel. Betrayal always cut the deepest. He pressed for more. "How do you know?" She swallowed hard. "I saw them. A few weeks ago, after closing, Bryce handed him an envelope, thick with cash. They were arguing, something about the take being lower than usual." She paused, her gaze dropping to the floor. Then he said something about a locker. "At the bus station. That's where they keep the real money." The bus station. A locker. It was almost too brazen, too obvious. But sometimes, the most audacious schemes were the easiest to overlook. "Anything else?" he asked, his mind already piecing together the puzzle. She hesitated again, her eyes filled with a deep, unsettling fear. "That opens his locker," she said finally, her voice barely audible, reaching in her pocket and pulling out a small, tarnished key. "Black duffel bag," she continued, her words tumbling out now, a torrent of suppressed fear and desperation. "He keeps a second phone in there, a burner. He uses it to coordinate things with Glenn." Daniel took the key, the cold metal a tangible link to the corruption festering within his company. He felt a cold rage settle in his bones, a quiet fury that promised retribution. He looked at Jenna, her face pale and drawn in the dim light. He saw the courage it had taken for her to come forward, the immense risk she was taking. He knew he had to act swiftly, decisively, not just for his company, but for her, for all the employees who had been silenced by fear and intimidation. He would dismantle this operation brick by brick, and he would start with Bryce, and then he would move on to Glenn. He owed it to Jenna. He owed it to himself. He owed it to the legacy of Whitmore's Chop House. The stale air of the locker room hung thick with the mingled scents of sweat, cheap cologne, and something faintly metallic like old blood. Daniel's hand, clutching the purloined key, trembled almost imperceptibly. He'd never been one for subterfuge, preferring the clean lines of a balance sheet to the murky depths of someone else's privacy. Yet, here he was, poised before a dinted metal locker, a trespasser in his own kingdom. He hesitated, a flicker of doubt. Was this truly necessary? Momentarily clouding his resolve. But the image of Jenna's face, etched with a weariness that belied her youth, hardened his purpose. He inserted the key, the click echoing in the confined space like a gunshot. The locker swung open, revealing a pathetic collection of worn work shirts and a pair of scuffed shoes. Beneath them, nestled amongst crumpled fast food wrappers, lay a stack of banded bills, thick enough to choke a horse. Daniel felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. This wasn't just mismanagement, it was blatant theft. His gaze shifted to a battered burner phone resting beside the cash. A primitive, almost childish device, but potent enough to weave a web of deceit. He picked it up, the plastic warm against his skin, feeling a strange disconnect between its innocuous appearance and the potential damage it represented. Unlocking it was surprisingly easy. A quick scroll through the text messages confirmed his suspicions, coded conversations about skimmed profits, veiled threats against employees, and casual mentions of Glenn Tate, the regional manager whose name had been suspiciously absent from Jenna's whispered accusations. Each message was a nail hammered into the coffin of his trust. He closed the locker, the metallic clang resonating with a finality that mirrored his own hardening resolve. The air felt heavier now, suffocating him with a weight of betrayal. He needed more, concrete proof that would stand up in court, evidence that would shatter the facade of normalcy Bryce had so carefully constructed. He moved towards Bryce's office, the key now feeling less like a tool of investigation and more like a weapon. The office was small, cramped, a stark contrast to the spacious, well-appointed spaces he occupied at corporate headquarters. A thin film of dust coated the cheap furniture, a testament to Bryce's lack of care. He opened the top drawer of the desk, his fingers brushing against something rough, a ledger. He pulled it out, the worn cover whispering tales of meticulously recorded discrepancies. The numbers danced before his eyes, a symphony of deceit, confirming the scale of the theft and the intricate web of lies that had ensnared his Fort Smith branch. He was so engrossed in the ledger that he didn't hear the door creak open. He didn't register the shift in the air until a shadow fell across the desk. He looked up, the ledger still clutched in his hand, to meet Bryce's gaze. The man's eyes, usually brimming with false bonhomie, were now narrowed, sharp as shards of ice. A flicker of recognition, quickly replaced by a mask of suspicion, then anger. A muscle twitched in his jaw, his face contorting into a grotesque parody of a smile. "You think you're slick?" Bryce's voice was low, laced with menace. "You didn't look scared enough to be just some customer." Daniel met his gaze, the weight of the ledger a solid presence in his hand. He felt a surge of anger, hot and raw, but he forced himself to remain calm. He'd come too far to lose control now. "You talk a lot for someone with dirty hands," Daniel replied, his voice even, betraying none of the turmoil churning within him. He saw a flicker of uncertainty in Bryce's eyes, a momentary crack in his carefully constructed facade. It was a small victory, but enough. Bryce's hand moved towards his back pocket, a subtle but unmistakable gesture. Daniel's mind raced, assessing the threat, calculating his options. He was older, perhaps not as physically imposing, but he had something Bryce didn't, the unwavering conviction of a man defending his legacy. He wasn't just fighting for his business. He was fighting for the memory of his father, for the countless employees who relied on him, for the very soul of Whitmore's Chop House. He knew, with a certainty that transcended logic, that he wouldn't back down. "Don't," Daniel said, his voice still calm, but now infused with a steel that surprised even himself. He placed the ledger on the desk, the thud echoing in the small room like a judge's gavel. "It's over, Bryce." The silence hung heavy between them, thick with unspoken threats and simmering resentment. Bryce's hand remained hovering near his back pocket, his face a mask of indecision. The air crackled with tension, the unspoken question hanging between them. What happens next? The fate of the Fort Smith branch, and perhaps even the wider Whitmore empire, hung precariously in the balance, suspended in the stale air of a small, dusty office, illuminated only by the flickering fluorescent light overhead. He knew, with an unsettling clarity, that this confrontation was just the beginning. The real battle was yet to come, but he was ready. He'd faced tougher odds before. He'd weathered storms that threatened to capsize his entire enterprise. This, he knew, was just another tempest he would navigate, another challenge he would overcome. He met Bryce's gaze, his own unwavering, a silent promise etched in the depths of his eyes. The game had changed, and Daniel Whitmore was prepared to play. The muted hum of the motel refrigerator, a constant low thrum that had faded into background noise during the night, now grated on Daniel's nerves. Sunlight, thin and weak, filtered through the gaps in the curtains, painting stripes across the worn carpet. He sat on the edge of the bed, the stiffness in his shoulders a testament to the fitful sleep he'd managed. Last night's revelations churned in his stomach like a bad oyster. He could still see Jenna's face, etched with fear and exhaustion, hear the tremor in her voice as she'd recounted Bryce's tactics. The way she glanced over her shoulder, even in the relative safety of his car, spoke volumes. He'd spent years building his business, brick by painstaking brick, and the thought of it being chipped away by such blatant corruption filled him with a cold anger. He'd promised Jenna he'd make things right, and Daniel Whitmore wasn't a man to break a promise. The shrill ring of the motel phone sliced through the quiet. He picked up, bracing himself. "Hello. Daniel, it's Glenn." The voice was smooth, almost too casual. Daniel's grip tightened on the receiver. He could practically picture Glenn, perfectly coiffed and feigning concern, likely sitting in his pristine office miles away. "Glenn," Daniel acknowledged, his tone flat. He didn't bother with pleasantries. He felt a prickle of disgust, remembering Glenn's jovial back-patting the last time they'd met. Had he known then? Had he been laughing in his face all along? "I heard about the incident last night," Glenn began, his voice laced with a carefully measured dose of concern. "Quite a situation. I wanted to assure you I'm looking into it personally." Daniel's inner voice sneered. Looking into it? He was knee-deep in it. "Is that so?" He let the skepticism drip from his voice. "Yes, of course," Glenn continued, a hint of impatience creeping into his tone. "I had no idea things had escalated to this point. Bryce could be a bit overzealous. I'll have a serious talk with him." "Overzealous," Daniel repeated, the word hanging in the air like a bad joke. "Glenn, we're talking about systematic theft and intimidation. Overzealous is forgetting to stock the napkins." A beat of silence. Daniel could almost hear the calculations whirring behind Glenn's smooth facade. "I didn't know about that part," Glenn finally said, his voice tight. "Didn't you?" Daniel countered. He closed his eyes, picturing the ledger Jenna had shown him, the discrepancies blatant as a flashing neon sign. "Or did you just choose to look the other way while you pocketed your share?" The silence on the other end stretched, thick with tension. Daniel opened his eyes, staring at the faded floral wallpaper, his mind a whirl of anger and a grim satisfaction. He'd hooked him. Glenn cleared his throat. "Daniel, you're jumping to conclusions. I've always been loyal to Whitmore's. I've dedicated years to this company." "Loyalty," Daniel echoed, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "You brought him in to do the dirty work while you kept your hands clean. That's not loyalty, Glenn. That's cowardice." "I can explain. I don't need your explanations," Daniel interrupted, his voice edged with steel. "I need your resignation. Consider this your 2 weeks' notice. You'll be hearing from my lawyer." He hung up before Glenn could sputter another word. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator. Daniel exhaled slowly, the tension slowly bleeding from his shoulders. He reached for his phone again, dialing Alicia's number. She answered on the second ring, her voice crisp and professional. "Daniel? What's the situation?" He relayed the conversation, the details of Glenn's denials and his eventual confession by omission. Alicia listened intently, occasionally interjecting with a sharp question. He could almost see her brow furrowed, mentally cataloging every piece of information. "I'll get started on the paperwork immediately," she said when he finished. "And I'll contact Ken Holland at the Fort Smith Times. This needs to be public knowledge." A wave of weariness washed over Daniel. He'd built Whitmore's on a foundation of honesty and quality, and the idea that it had been tarnished, even in one small corner of his empire, felt like a personal betrayal. But there was also a sense of grim resolve. He wouldn't let this stand. He would cleanse the rot, no matter how deep it went. He owed it to Jenna, to his loyal employees, and to the legacy he'd spent a lifetime building. The fight was far from over, but the first blow had been struck. The silence in the motel room, no longer oppressive, now held a fragile sense of hope. The Fort Smith air hung heavy with the remnants of a summer storm, a dampness that clung to the aging brick facade of Whitmore's Chop House. Inside, the restaurant was a tableau of exhaustion. The lingering scent of stale grease and cheap disinfectant wrestled with the fading ghost of charbroiled steaks. Daniel Whitmore stood by the dusty front window, watching the last of the evening's straggling customers disappear into the rainy night. His reflection, a stranger in a carefully constructed disguise of worn denim and a baseball cap, stared back at him, a phantom of the man who had once poured his heart and soul into building this empire. This branch, this tarnished outpost of his legacy, was a physical manifestation of his failure. He felt a sharp pang of something akin to grief, not just for the business, but for the lost ideal it represented. He pushed the thought aside, focusing on the task at hand. The scene within mirrored the decay outside. Jenna, the waitress who had risked everything to tip him off, was methodically wiping down tables, her movements robotic, her face pale under the harsh fluorescent lights. He watched her for a moment, her weariness a stark contrast to the fire that had flickered in her eyes earlier, when she'd slipped him the crumpled napkin with the damning figure scrawled on it. He owed her, and he intended to repay that debt in full. The others, the remaining kitchen staff and the lone, gawky host who had been oblivious to everything, huddled near the swinging doors to the kitchen, their whispers tight and anxious. Bryce, the architect of this slow, insidious rot, was nowhere to be seen. Daniel's jaw tightened. He wouldn't escape. Not this time. Daniel took a deep breath, the stale air catching in his throat. He straightened his shoulders and walked toward the remaining employees. The low hum of conversation ceased abruptly. Their gazes, a mix of fear and suspicion, settled on him. He felt a knot tighten in his stomach, a strange mix of anger and pity. These people, these hard-working individuals, had been betrayed. He cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the sudden silence. "I appreciate you all staying," he began, his voice low and steady. He could feel their unease, a palpable tension in the air. It thickened the silence between his words. He knew he had to choose them carefully, like stepping stones across a treacherous stream. "I know things haven't been easy here." The host, a young man barely out of high school, fidgeted nervously, his eyes darting towards the kitchen doors. Jenna stopped wiping down the tables, her gaze fixed on Daniel, a flicker of something he couldn't quite decipher in its depths. Hope, perhaps, or maybe just a desperate plea for this to be real, for someone to finally break the suffocating grip of Bryce's reign. Daniel continued, his voice gaining strength. "You all deserve better. You deserve a workplace where you're respected, where your hard work is valued, and where you don't have to live in fear." He paused, letting his words sink in. He saw a subtle shift in their postures, a slight easing of tension. "Bryce is gone." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. A collective gasp rippled through the small group. The host's jaw dropped. A cook in a stained apron let out a shaky breath. Jenna remained still, her expression unreadable, but Daniel could see the faintest tremor in her hands. He pressed on, his voice rising with a controlled intensity. "And Glenn's next." He met Jenna's gaze, a silent acknowledgement of her courage. "I've seen the records. I know what's been happening here." He paused again, letting the weight of his words settle. "And I'm here to fix it." The silence that followed was different this time. Not the strained quiet of fear, but the stunned silence of disbelief. He knew they were waiting, holding their breath, wondering if this was just another empty promise. He had to convince them, not just with words, but with action. "My name is Daniel Whitmore," he announced, removing his cap. The overhead fluorescent lights glinted off his silvering hair. "I founded this company, and I'm taking it back." He saw recognition dawn in their eyes, followed by a wave of astonishment. He could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the palpable change from apprehension to a fragile, nascent hope. He knew this was just the beginning. Rebuilding trust, restoring what had been broken, would be a long and arduous process. But in that moment, standing in the stillness of the almost empty restaurant, he felt a surge of resolve. He wouldn't let them down. "I want to hear from you," he continued, his voice softer now, but no less firm. "Anyone who has been affected by Bryce's actions, anyone who has information to share, I want you to come forward. I promise you, you will be protected, and justice will be served." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card, handing it to Jenna. "This is my associate, Alicia Knox. She'll be here tomorrow to take your statements. Anything you tell her will be kept confidential." Jenna took the card, her fingers brushing against his. He saw a flicker of gratitude in her eyes, a silent thank you that resonated deeper than any spoken words. He nodded to her, a silent promise of support. He addressed the others again, his voice resonating with sincerity. "This restaurant, this company, it was built on honesty and hard work. We're going to rebuild it together, brick by brick, and we're going to make it stronger than ever before." He looked at each of them, holding their gazes, forging a connection. The silence stretched, then broke as the cook, his face etched with years of hard labor, stepped forward. "Mr. Whitmore," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "There's a lot to tell." Daniel met his gaze, a flicker of something like hope igniting in his chest. This was the start, the first crack in the wall of silence. He knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, filled with legal battles and the painful process of rebuilding. But in that moment, standing amidst the lingering scent of stale grease and faded dreams, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He would restore his legacy, not for himself, but for the people who had believed in it, for the hard-working individuals who deserve better. He owed them that much, and he would not fail. The storm outside had passed, leaving behind a cleansed air, heavy with the promise of a new beginning. The Fort Smith Times-Record's headline screamed, "Local chop house corruption exposed, systemic theft and intimidation." Jenna, staring at the grainy image of Bryce being escorted out in handcuffs, felt a chill despite the summer heat. Ken Holland's article, surprisingly detailed, chronicled Bryce's scheme, the regional manager's complicity, and even hinted at broader issues within Whitmore's. Her own testimony, carefully anonymized, formed the backbone of the piece. Relief warred with a nagging unease. Bryce was gone, but the larger system that enabled him that remained. Her phone buzzed. An unknown number. Hesitantly, she answered. "Jenna." The voice was familiar, calm, laced with a southern drawl she now associated with quiet strength. "Daniel Whitmore. The article is causing quite a stir." He paused, the silence pregnant with unspoken things. "Meet me at the Fort Smith location tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. We have much to discuss." He hung up before she could reply. Much to discuss. What could that possibly mean? A flicker of anxiety, like a moth's wing against a bare bulb, danced in her stomach. Was he angry? Grateful? She couldn't decipher the tone, the intent behind his words. The next morning, the Fort Smith Whitmore's was a ghost of its former self. Closed, of course, after the scandal. The air hung heavy with the stale scent of yesterday's grease and disappointment. Daniel stood by the locked front doors, an almost tangible aura of authority radiating from him despite his casual attire. He offered a small, genuine smile as she approached. "Jenna, thank you for coming." His gaze was steady, searching. "I've been reading Mr. Holland's follow-up pieces. It seems Fort Smith was just the tip of the iceberg." His words confirmed her deepest fears. Other whispers, hushed confessions from employees at other Whitmore's branches, were finding their way into print. Tales of skimmed profits, manipulated inventory, a culture of fear meticulously cultivated by ambitious managers. Jenna's own act of defiance had unraveled a tightly woven tapestry of deceit. She swallowed, the knot in her throat constricting her voice. It wasn't just Bryce, Mr. Whitmore. It's systemic. Daniel's eyes darkened, a flicker of something cold and sharp flashing within their depths. I know, Jenna. I know. He turned, gazing at the darkened restaurant, his expression unreadable. My father built this company on principles of honesty and quality. Somewhere along the way, those principles got lost. He turned back to her, his gaze piercing. I intend to find them again. He spent the next few weeks in constant motion. Phone calls to Alicia Knox, his legal counsel, were interspersed with hushed meetings, flights to other cities, the relentless gathering of evidence. Jenna, now temporarily managing the Fort Smith location during its restructuring, found herself increasingly drawn into his orbit. He valued her insights, her understanding of the day-to-day operations, the unspoken language of the staff. The national news picked up the story. Whitmore's Chop House, once a symbol of Southern hospitality, became synonymous with corporate greed and exploitation. The stock price plummeted. The CEO, a man named Charles Thornton, remained stubbornly silent, hiding behind carefully crafted press releases and legal jargon. Daniel, however, refused to be silenced. He leveraged his family name, his remaining influence, and the growing public outcry to demand a meeting. The air in Thornton's office was thick with tension. The panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline seemed to mock the crumbling empire beneath. Thornton, a man whose tailored suit could not disguise the puffiness around his eyes, the slight tremor in his hands, sat behind a massive mahogany desk, his expression a mixture of annoyance and apprehension. Daniel, he began, his voice strained, this whole situation has been blown out of proportion. Blown out of proportion? Daniel's voice was soft, deceptively calm. Charles, multiple locations are under investigation. Franchisees are threatening lawsuits. The Whitmore name, the legacy my father built, is being dragged through the mud. He leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. And you call it blown out of proportion? Thornton shifted uncomfortably in his chair. We're addressing the issues, Daniel. We're implementing new oversight procedures, conducting internal audits. His words trailed off under Daniel's unwavering stare. Oversight procedures? Audits? Daniel's voice hardened. That's not enough, Charles. The rot goes deep. It's in the culture, in the very fabric of this company. He paused, letting the silence hang heavy in the air. I have a proposition for you, Charles. A way to salvage what's left of Whitmore's. The terms were steep. A complete restructuring of the management team. A revised franchise agreement that prioritized ethical practices and employee welfare. And, most importantly, Daniel's return to the company, not as a figurehead, but as the chief operating officer with the authority to implement the necessary changes. Thornton balked. He argued, he pleaded, he threatened. But Daniel held firm. He knew he held the moral high ground, the public support, and perhaps most importantly, Thornton's fear. The fear of complete and utter ruin. Finally, after hours of tense negotiation, Thornton relented. The agreement was signed, the press release drafted. Daniel Whitmore, the prodigal son, was returning to reclaim his family's legacy. Later that evening, Daniel called Jenna. It's done, he said, his voice tinged with weariness but also a quiet satisfaction. I've accepted the COO position. A wave of relief washed over Jenna. More than relief, a sense of hope. That's wonderful, Mr. Whitmore. I have one more thing to discuss with you, Jenna. He paused. I'm promoting you to general manager of the Fort Smith location. Officially, I need someone I can trust to rebuild, someone who understands the importance of integrity. Jenna's breath caught in her throat. General manager. It was more than she'd ever dared to hope for. I won't let you down, Mr. Whitmore, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I know you won't, Jenna, he replied, a hint of a smile in his voice. I know you won't. The line went dead, leaving Jenna standing in the quiet of her apartment, the weight of responsibility and the flicker of a new beginning settling upon her shoulders. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the newly polished wood floors of Whitmore's chop house. The air, once thick with the greasy despair of neglect, now hummed with the low, comfortable murmur of conversation and the clinking of silverware. The Fort Smith branch, just weeks ago a hollow shell of its former self, pulsed with a revitalized energy. Jenna, her uniform crisp and clean, moved between tables with a lightness in her step she hadn't felt in months. The dark circles under her eyes had faded, replaced by a quiet strength that emanated from within. She poured iced tea for a family celebrating a birthday, her hand steady, her smile genuine. Just a few weeks ago, this same act felt like a mechanical performance in a place she desperately wanted to leave. Now, a sense of belonging, a fragile hope, had taken root in her chest. She caught the eye of a young busboy, his face scrubbed clean, his movements no longer marked by the sullen resignation she remembered. He offered a shy smile, and she returned it, a silent acknowledgement of the shared burden lifted. The kitchen, once a battlefield of hushed threats and simmering resentments, was now a symphony of coordinated activity. The head chef, a new hire with a passion for honest cooking, barked orders with a jovial authority that invited respect, not fear. The aroma of searing steaks and simmering sauces mingled with the clatter of pans and the rhythmic thwack of cleavers against cutting boards, a soundtrack of honest labor, not stifled desperation. Even the air vents seemed to exhale a cleaner, fresher breath. Daniel Whitmore, seated in a quiet corner booth, watched the scene unfold with a quiet satisfaction that resonated deep within him. He'd spent the last few weeks rebuilding, not just a restaurant, but the lives of the people who worked within its walls. He'd instituted new management, retrained staff, and implemented stricter inventory controls. More importantly, he'd listened. He'd heard the stories of intimidation, the whispers of theft, the quiet desperation that had permeated every corner of this place. He'd met with every employee individually, assuring them of their safety and promising a future free from the suffocating fear that had gripped them for so long. He sipped his coffee, the bitterness oddly comforting, a reminder of the rot he'd unearthed, the poison he'd purged. He wasn't naive enough to think everything was perfect. Healing took time. Trust, once broken, was a fragile thing. But he saw the seeds of change taking root, a slow but steady blossoming of hope within these walls. A shadow fell across his table. He looked up to see Glenn Tate, handcuffed and flanked by 2 police officers. Glenn's face was pale, his eyes hollow. The arrogance that had once clung to him like a second skin now stripped away, leaving only a raw, exposed vulnerability. Daniel felt a flicker of pity, quickly extinguished by the memory of the harm Glenn had inflicted, the lives he'd damaged in his pursuit of greed. Justice, Daniel reminded himself, was not about vengeance. It was about accountability. He watched as Glenn was led away. The restaurant's bustling activity momentarily paused, eyes following the disgraced regional manager's exit. Then, as if a collective breath had been held and released, the hum of conversation resumed. The clinking of silverware picked up its rhythm. The interruption, though significant, was brief, a fleeting reminder of the darkness that had once held sway. The focus now was on the light, on the future. Later that evening, after the dinner rush had subsided, Daniel gathered the staff. He stood before them, not as an owner, but as a fellow human, his voice quiet, his words measured. This was never just about steak, he began, his gaze sweeping across the faces before him, each etched with its own story of resilience and renewed hope. It was about people. It was about creating a place where people could come to work with dignity, with respect, and with a sense of purpose. He paused, letting his words sink in. He saw Jenna standing near the back, her arms crossed, a small, almost imperceptible nod of agreement. It was a small gesture, but it held the weight of shared understanding, a silent acknowledgement of the battle fought and won. Change doesn't start with a title, he continued, his voice gaining strength. It starts with courage. Speak up. Show up. Don't be afraid to shine a light on the darkness. His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, a call to action, a reminder that even in the face of adversity, one voice could make a difference. He looked at Jenna again, and this time, she met his gaze, her eyes no longer clouded with fear, but shining with a quiet determination. In that moment, he knew that the Fort Smith branch of Whitmore's Chop House wasn't just a restaurant anymore. It was a testament to the power of courage, a beacon of hope in a world that often felt shrouded in shadows. The fight had been hard, the scars remained, but the healing had begun. And that, he realized, was a victory worth savoring. Days later, a local newspaper, the Fort Smith Chronicle, ran a front-page story detailing the corruption that had plagued the restaurant. Ken Holland, the reporter, had meticulously pieced together the story, interviewing staff members, reviewing financial records, and exposing the intricate web of deceit that Bryce and Glenn had woven. The article, titled Whitmore's Whistleblower, Waitress Exposes Rot at Local Chop House, painted a stark picture of the systemic theft and intimidation that had occurred, while also highlighting the bravery of Jenna, the anonymous waitress who had risked everything to bring the truth to light. The article concluded with a quote from Daniel, a promise to rebuild trust and restore the integrity of the Whitmore's name. "This is not just a restaurant," he had said. "It's a family, and we will take care of our own." As Daniel read the article, a sense of closure washed over him. The truth was out. The wounds were beginning to heal. He folded the newspaper, the crisp sound echoing the finality of the ordeal. He thought of Jenna, of her quiet strength, her unwavering commitment to what was right. He knew she wouldn't want to be singled out, wouldn't want to be labeled a hero. But in his eyes, and in the eyes of many others, she was. She was a testament to the power of a single voice, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, hope could prevail. The Fort Smith branch of Whitmore's, once a symbol of decay and corruption, was now a symbol of renewal, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. And that, Daniel knew, was a legacy worth fighting for.